Hey gang, welcome to Dr. Frank's Finance World. I am Dr. Frank, the bank, because I've tried to teach you something about finance that you can use to make money down the road. This lesson is discussing the weighted average cost of capital. WACC is an interesting concept because it's basically, in its most basic sense at least, how much the money costs the firm. In other words, what rate did they have to pay to borrow money? And there's different ways that they borrow money. The three most basic ways, I guess, if you will, is they use it in the form of the debt out there. So this is sort of the debt component out there, or they issue preferred stock, or they actually issue common stock. Those are the three methods, and it is a combination of what each of these methods cost, the required rate of return for preferred or for common stock or for debt, the times the weight, how much money you put in it, decides what the cost of the capital will be for the firm. So the weights in this example are the weights of the firm's capital structure, how much money is in each. The R's, of course, refer to the cost of each component. We will go over those individually. And the cost of capital is used primarily to make decisions that involve raising new capital and therefore investing it in projects. So the basic idea is you only want to do a project if it at the very least pays for the cost of the money you had to invest in it. And in order to find that cost, we have to do weighted average cost of capital. So how are the weights determined? It's actually pretty simple even in the real world. It's how much money is in each invested or raised, I guess, from each of those methods. How much is in debt, how much is in equity, and so forth. And the simple example we have here, there is no preferred stock. Preferred stock is actually quite a bit more rare than the other two, so this is probably more of what you'd see. But basically in this case, they said, hey, if the firm raised $400,000, $100,000 in debt, and $300,000 in equity, 100 of the 400,000 here would actually be the amount of debt, which is 25% would be weighting wise in the debt, and 75% or 300 of the 400 would be in equity. And when you take the cost of each of these and multiply them by their weights, you're going to have what the weighted average cost of capital is. So the example we have here is something called Coleman Technologies. You're going to have to refer back to this part of the video or this picture a fair number of times, because this is the basic information that we have in order to calculate what the costs are and so forth out there. So when you do the cost of debt, it does involve a tax component. So they give you the tax rate here. This part of the problem right here is actually you're looking at the cost of, let me make this on everyone here. This is the debt calculation you will make. It's a basic bond problem. And when you calculate a basic bond problem and you come up with the I, what is called the yield to maturity, what they would have to place new debt into the market at, you will have what the yield to maturity part of the calculation is, but we need the tax part of it to solve as well. As well, if they do have preferred stock, and they're going to show you how to do it in this example, it is essentially a perpetuity, where the required rate of return, we would call it normally a cost of preferred, is a function of the dividend divided by what the price was at that given point in time. And since the dividend is a perpetuity, it is always the same. And you're going to do just like a bond problem. If 10% is the coupon rate it's paying on preferred stock, and it has essentially $100 face value or par value, the dividend, the payment up here is going to be $10. And then you're going to divide it by the price. And finally, when it comes to common stock, there's two ways to solve for it. One of them is CAPM, and you see the basic components of CAPM. We've talked about that in previous videos. The other is to move around the value of a company at time zero using the constant growth model and solving that for the cost of equity. And so we have the basic components of what we would need in order to calculate it that way. So the example they're giving you here is they just give it to you. You have a 30% cost of debt, or weighting in the debt, let's just put it that way. 10% is in preferred and 60% is in common equity. So when you come down to the next one down here, if that's true, we have the weights now, 30, 10, and 60. What we need to solve the WACC equation is what is the cost of each of these? Now, to find the component for debt, we're going to have to figure out what that is using the bond problem there. And the reason why it's 1 minus the tax rate is when you work your way down an income statement from the revenue minus the cost of goods sold gives you the gross profit, minus the overhead and depreciation gives you operating income, also known as EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes. You subtract out the interest expense to get earnings before taxes, and then you actually pay taxes on it. So the interest expense for debt is a tax deductible expense. So the reality is you get a tax break on it, and that's why they have the 1 minus the tax rate here. So the yield to maturity, of course, we figure out, and that's why we do the tax adjustment out there. So in the example we gave, or you look up there on slide 3, you can figure out it was a 15-year, 12% semi-annual coupon. So we have to make the semi-annual adjustments out there, and it sells for $11.52. So in doing the problem down here, the 15 years is actually, since it's semi-annual, you multiply it by 2 to get the 30 they use right here. This is simply the price that they put in as the present value as a negative because it's out of pocket. It's a cash flow out of your pocket. The semi-annual coupon payment is 12% times 1,000, which would actually be $120 a year, but it's semi-annual, so you put in 60 for that, and then you have the future value. In solving for the yield to maturity of the I, you come up with 5. But that is a semi-annual number. So you have to bring it back into annual by multiplying by 2. So 10% is actually the yield to maturity, and that's what we will use when we're solving our cost of debt equation. So here we are, we have the after tax, before tax. We found out that our yield to maturity or our cost of debt was 10%. There we're taking out the tax component, 1 minus the 40%, which gives you 0.6 down here. And ultimately, your cost of debt is 6%. And that's what we will use when we calculate the weighted average cost of capital. And they talk about flotation costs. We're not issuing more debt, usually pretty small for debt, so they ignore it. We'll talk about the flotation costs when we get to your cost of equity. So so we did our cost of debt. We found out that that was 6%. Now we're going to get overall. So we're going to figure out what our cost of preferred is. And like I said before, it is essentially a perpetuity where you're taking the forever dividend divided by price. We're simply swapping it out, right? If you took the required rate of it, normally what we would have is we would have the price of it is the dividend over the required rate. But what we're doing is we're swapping these two to solve for required rate, and you end up with this equation exactly right here. So when we take the dividend and we calculate that as $10, remember it was a 10% coupon on a $100 preferred stock. So there was the payment, the dividend for it. And in this case, we're moving the price down here, and the price they gave us was $111.10. We found out that our cost of preferred, what we have to pay as a yield to raise money through preferred stock, is 9%. So now we're down to the last component because we already know the weights. We know both these components, and is your cost of equity or required rate for your stock out there. And there's 2 different ways we can do that. So the first way is CAPM. We're going to do that in just a second, which is simply the risk-free rate plus the return of the market minus the risk-free. This can also be called a market risk premium, which is what they gave you in the problem on slide 3 up there. And you're going to multiply it by the beta of the stock. It tells you how that investment moves relative to the market and adjusts the market required rate return for the stock. The other way is when you're trying to find the required rate of return using the constant growth model. The way that was before is the price at time 0 is the dividend at time 1 over K sub E minus G. If we swap these two again, with this being in parentheses here, then we would end up with K sub E minus G is the dividend at time 1 over the price at time 0, and moving the G over, you have plus G over here, and you end up with exactly this equation, which is the cost of equity, or the return for the stock, as we're saying, is the dividend at time 1 over the price at time 0 plus G. You're simply moving this original equation, which we've used before. So going through here, we see that using the CAPM, it gave us that the risk-free rate was 7%, and that the market risk premium, the return premium of the market is what they're saying, it was 6%. So when we multiply that, we give us everything in parentheses by 1.2. This became 7.2% down here, and you have a cost of equity using CAPM of 14.2%. But it's not the only way we could actually calculate it. When you use the constant growth model to back into it like we are just doing before, we find out that the cost of the equity or the return required on the stock is the dividend at time 1 over the price at time 0 plus G. Well, we had to grow the dividend. We had the dividend at time 0, but we did not have it at time 1. So we had to grow D0 to become D1. We knew the growth rate was 5%. So when you grow $4.19 by 1.05, you get essentially $4.40. So when you take this $4.39.95, the dividend at time 1, divided by the price at time 0, $50, and add the 5% that you have growth rate, you end up with a 13.8% cost of equity using the constant growth model. So what do you use in between? What do you use in that case? Will you always get different numbers or the same numbers? You probably won't get exactly the same numbers, but you should have numbers that are in the same ballpark. You might just consider using 14% here, since one was 14.2 and 13.8. So there is a little bit of give and take when you're calculating these component costs. So why is the cost of retained earnings cheaper than the cost of issuing new stock? In other words, we talk about K sub E, but the reality is, if we have to issue more stock, we don't get to keep the entire price that we sell it for. So you have to pay an underwriter to issue those shares, and the cost of that is called flotation. So we're using the same equation on the constant growth, the dividend at time 1 over the price at time 0 plus G, but if you're having to issue new stock, you don't get to keep all of the price. You only get to keep part of it, and therefore this number becomes smaller. So the cost over here becomes bigger, and basically the cost of equity when you issue new stock is more expensive because you don't get to keep all of the money that you raise. All right, so they're doing an example here of where you have the flotation cost, exactly the same problem we had before, 419 D0 times 1.05. There's the $50, but they're saying in this case, you're going to spend 15% of the issuance of the stock of what you raise is going to be gone to somebody else. So you only get to keep 85 cents of every dollar here. And when you take the same $4.40 essentially and divide it by the fact you don't get to keep all $50 and add the same G, you end up with, instead of a 13.8%, you end up with a 15.4% cost of equity. And the reality is firms have a certain cost based on how much they raise, and then the cost of debt or equity goes up, or both, and they have a higher level cost, and then the cost of one or both goes up. So every time they raise more money, it essentially costs them more because the market thinks they're riskier. And as the cost gets higher and higher, some projects actually become a negative for you to do them. And that's how it actually works in the real world here. So anyhow, filling in all the costs from the previous problem, we said it was a 30% weight, and there was the 10% bond yield I that we found on it with a 1 minus the tax rate of 0.6. So if you took the 6% we talked about here and multiplied it by 0.3, you actually had 1.83%, and that is essentially your component cost for debt. 10% of your money previously in the problem was in preferred. We said it was a 9